All right. Hey, Hasu. Welcome on. How are you doing?
David, thanks for having me.
Of course. So I have been uh, actually very interested to connect with you for many years now. I think you are maybe the closest thing crypto has to a Renaissance man. Like you are involved in so many things at quite a high level, from Flashbots and MEV to Lido to Maker to DeFi at large, and maybe even now back to Bitcoin. So maybe I wanted to start this off by winding the tapes back a bit and understanding your backstory. How did you get into all of this?
No one has ever called me a Renaissance man before. I would have to say thank you. I like that. That's, can get used to that. Um, yeah, I mean, some people call it having OCD, some others call it having a lot of interest. Well, I started way back in the day. I think, when was that? Maybe in like 26, 27, I started playing online poker. Eventually did that for a living. Like I became fairly successful, dropped out of university to focus full time on playing. Um, Maybe 1 or 2 years after Bitcoin was created, I first came in touch with it because I guess we were always settling debts between different folks, like sending money from A to B. And someone just asked me to, go sign up on that website, Mount Gox, and like buy some BTC and just like withdraw it to their address, which I did. And I think from that point on, we like used it occasionally. But I never really, knew what it was or like focused on it or like held on to any of it. It was more like, oh yeah, like it's this other it's yet another like payment method for like settling some debts online. Um, Towards my later years in poker, I was a top player for many years, and I would kind of there are a lot of equivalents between kind of doing that and being like a professional athlete, in the sense that the stakes are pretty high. It becomes very professionalized. Like you have to invest a lot into getting better, both financially but also in terms of training. Like the training would maybe take up like two-thirds, two two three quarters, and like the playing would be really the rest. And I think the more I did that, the more I fell in love with like the kind of studying and teaching side of the game, more so than like competing myself at the highest level. And yeah, later in my career, I realized that I really enjoyed that side of things much more. And as poker wound down, because the industry kind of got smaller, like many people stopped playing, and it wasn't that much good action anymore. I knew that, when I left poker, the one thing that I knew was, well, I want another topic that I can like go that has a lot of intellectual depth, like poker, where you can really like sink your teeth and your time into it, and there's no limit to how deep you can go, right? It's this infinite rabbit hole in the sense, and you can have a lot of aha moments. I also knew that I wanted to, study it, and I wanted to write about it and teach it to others. And one thing that was I felt was missing from poker was it had very little real world impact, right? So it is a intellectually speaking, it is a fascinating game, and you can learn a lot about life and like about business and so on, from playing it and from studying it. So it has that kind of meta component to it, but like whether I'm a professional poker player or not has like zero you know net productive like impact on the world. And after doing that for a decade plus, I was like, man, I want to do something that has like a little more of a real world footprint and maybe can change the world more for the better. And I think I pretty early on, then got into crypto, after not taking not much of a break, and I fell in love with that almost right away, I would say. Like once I really started to look into it, the potential became clear to me pretty fast. And yeah, also that it would have the depth that I was looking for in my next topic that I would basically dedicate my life to. And yeah, so I then, back then, Bitcoin was the only game in town, I would say, back in like 2017 maybe. Like, I mean, there was a ton of stuff. There were, the whole like ICO boom, and Ethereum existed, but it didn't really have any use cases. And then it was like just like a ton of scams, right? Like it was very clear that there was Bitcoin, and then there was everything else, and in the everything else you had like a gradient of like you had like really shitty stuff, like really obviously really obvious scams, and then you had stuff like where you weren't quite sure, like they were trying to do something good, like to differentiate from what was out there, but were more or less successful at that, I would say. And so it was very natural for me to be kind of gravitating towards Bitcoin, and I knew that this topic had an infinite amount of like potential to kind of to learn about, just because it was straddling so many different topics. Right? It was like straddling like finance and like economics, but also politics and philosophy, political science, computer science, obviously, game theory, like so many different things. And well, that made it very intellectually interesting, but it also meant that if you're like, just a curious generalist, it actually, doesn't take you very long until you can make some actual contributions to the space, right? Like, let's say you get into, some kind of, field, maybe physics or mathematics, or, some very specialized, but more like kind of more like monolithic field, in the sense then, it can take you like 2 decades, right, to kind of catch up. Even if you're studying it full time, it can take you like 2 decades to catch up even to what like the ultimate frontier is of like the state of that science, right? And when you have something that is straddling so many different industries or so many different fields, then there's so many white spots on the map where just like nobody has looked before, because nobody, not many people have maybe asked, okay, what is like Bitcoin from the lens of, maybe, like what is the kind of intersection between like maybe the governance side of things and like the kind of software side of things, and like social contracts theory side of things, right? That was maybe one of the very, very obvious kind of things that I was asking back then. One of kind of the pieces that I wrote, was around like how Bitcoin is governed by a social contract. And I think those things followed very naturally, when you just come into a field and it's like, oh, code is law, right? Everybody's saying code is law, for example, right? But then, oh yeah, but Bitcoin had this bug, right, where we printed like billions of Bitcoins, and like that got rolled back, right? So why was it code not law back then, right? And you just like you learn how things really work, right? And kind of science is ultimately, it's about making like theories that can like explain the world, in the sense that they're predictive about like how real systems and like real people actually act, right? And it was clear that like, well, code is law is not actually like a valid theory, right? It's like, yeah, it's like, it's an ambition, but code is law is not absolute, right? But what is actually absolute is that there's a social contract in Bitcoin that says a bunch of things, where there's like 21 million coins, and it's like permissionless for everybody to use, and like a bunch of other things. And then you have this software that is trying to kind of implement and automate that social contract. And when the software actually diverges, then actually the social contract is absolute. And like the software, if possible at all, is just rolled back to like what the social contract says should have happened, right? And then that became, I think, the prevailing theory, in crypto, And so I think that's an example of I guess of where you just like you look at a question maybe through like a multidisciplinary lens, and you maybe a lot of people, I guess, were thinking like that, so I don't want to say it was like like a crazy contribution or anything, but like just an example of how you can, if you have a multidisciplinary view, you can come into a field like crypto, and you can, you know, make contributions that ultimately like other people can appreciate. Yeah, I guess I pause here. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
there's more. There's
No,
much
it's
more,
it's
but yeah.
it's 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 very fascinating for sure.
Uh-huh.
I quickly want to close the point on the poker stuff.
Uh-huh.
I'm curious, like, are
Yeah.
you still involved in poker? And how do you think that industry has changed over the past, I don't know, 10, 15 plus years when you were involved? Like, do things like, you know, it's
Mm.
kind of like what you see in like the chess field. Like there's so much like of the game theory optimal play. Like, is it still the same stuff, or is it a totally different world now?
No, I mean, it's basically, I would say a lot of the things that were already like in force when I was still playing and when I left, I mean, they kind of reached, some of them just reached like their natural conclusions. Uh, like poker is a game of skill and chance both, right? And I mean that, you know, that's why poker has an active like real money scene, and chess doesn't, right? Because it's purely a game of skill, right? And it's not, it has, you know, a limited kind of scene around like who are the best players in the world, but those players are not like wagering, like they're not like betting their own money, etc. Like it's more like, you know, they play for like sponsorship and stuff. And so in poker, you know, the good players know who the other good players are. Like they have no incentive to play against each other. It's like lose lose, right? Like after like the house takes its cut. And so poker as an industry really is like kept alive by the inflow of like recreational, like funds that are brought in by like recreational players, right? And you know, in the poker pros are like the market makers, right? So there are a lot of parallels basically between like poker and trading. And like you have, you know, the recreational players who come in, and then you have the market makers who are basically there to play with them. And you know, when there's no net new money coming in, then like this, you know, the market makers just playing against each other basically is like lose lose for them, right? Like sometimes people play for ego, and like those people tend to go bankrupt, you know, at some point. But yeah, so I mean that happened basically to poker. Like it was a game, and you have like two kind of forces here, like two kind of forces at the meta level. One is that games are subject to fashion. So one decade maybe like one game is just en vogue, and then like next decade like people want to play a different game, right? And so poker went into fashion pretty heavily around like Chris Moneymaker winning the WSOP, and like Lady Gaga like recording like Poker Face, and like this was really, you know, the start of like a massive poker boom. But then like maybe 15 years later it kind of like had played itself out, and people were like gravitating more towards like other games. I mean, like video games were getting pretty big by then, and like loot boxes, crates, this kind of stuff got pretty big, I would say. Also maybe crypto was in like its early innings as well, and like the ICO boom I think pulled, you know, some people also away. But it was really more like, I think it was really like more, you know, gambling games, you know, both like video games with like crates and stuff like Farmville, etc. I think ultimately that, you know, ended up, it's just like different forms of entertainment, like all compete with each other for like your time and your money. And the second trend was that poker as a game, it doesn't really evolve, right? Like, you know, it has the same rules. I mean, there are many variants of poker, but the main variants that were like the most popular, they don't really evolve, right? But what does evolve is like the skill level of the overall like player base, right? Because the pros are constantly investing money to get better and better. The recreational players also get better. I mean, partially because, well, they just like learn by osmosis. Some of them maybe also study a little bit. But then you have like also just like natural selection process, right? And so like the level of the overall player base just like gets higher and higher and higher. And then, you know, the game just becomes much more like very small edges, like the margins get really small. And if you're then a new player, the learning curve to catch up to that level of play that is like the standard also gets bigger and bigger. And so the game actually becomes less attractive to newcomers. Right? And that is one way in which like games die, is that they just become like quote unquote solved, like you mentioned, like game theory optimal or GTO, which is like, you know, finding like Nash equilibria in like games of, you know, competitive games and like starting to approximate those. And this is what happened in poker. Like all of those different like trends converged, and like the industry still exists, but it's like much smaller now than it used to be. And so most of the really good games are now like hosted basically in like private venues, both online and offline. Like the access is exclusive. Everybody knows each other. And yeah, so the game has like changed quite a lot, right? It's no longer like, there's these like high stakes tables online, and anybody can join, and like there's like a new guy maybe like every week or every month. Like it doesn't work that way. I mean, you can't simply, even for like reasons of trust, just because like I don't know, like solvers and such have become so good that like anybody can run it. Anybody can like get a solver for like $50, run it on their computer, and like basically cheat like trivially in like online poker. And that's why, I mean, online poker is kind of dead at like the highest level. And that's why like more games are gravitating towards like, well, people are staking their reputation, they know each other, and or they meet like in offline locations and like play like in Vegas or Manila or Macau and so on. So yeah, or like home games maybe, in like other places. I'm sure there's home games in every like major city, but it is like now an exclusive club, more so I would say than it used to be in the past. And so it's I don't really engage with it at all anymore. I haven't played for many years, but like I have some friends who still play, and so sometimes I like talk to them about it.
Okay, very interesting. The comparison of crypto and market making to poker, I think, is very, very fascinating. And this kind of paradigm of, I guess, like the top players are basically just hoping for new retail to kind of come in to beat them. Like they don't they don't want to compete
Yeah.
against each other. I think that's a very interesting parallel to some of the games that are maybe being played in crypto, and kind of breaking out from like the gambling mentality to real product market fit. And that's a question maybe I'll put a pin in, but something we can address a little bit
Mhm.
later. Now I want to go to the other thing that you're saying of kind of your journey into crypto. I think is very fascinating. Like a parallel I'm hearing from a lot of very successful people is that our industry is kind of very meritocratic in a sense. Like our founding cryptographer Liam was a self-taught cryptographer, and he just started doing his own research and then posting online, and eventually he became one of
Mm.
the top cryptographers in the world. And it sounds like there was a similar journey for you, that there was just this idea of obsession and interest. And John Charbonneau talks about the same thing. It's like he just went home and all he could think about is this industry. And I think that it's really beautiful that we have the ability for people to just be obsessed and come in and post their content, and then it start getting picked up and actually get incredible legs. And I think one of those things that you kind of early on posted about was stuff like the Bitcoin security budget. I think that's one of the initial reasons why I found you. So I'm curious, maybe like if you can talk us through like when you wrote that piece, and what your current feelings are on the Bitcoin security budget.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think I mean, so actually two things to unpack. I mean, I think what makes like coming into crypto like so rewarding, or like why many people fall down the rabbit hole this hard, is because there are like so many feedback loops built in, right? Like you have the kind of feedback loop where if this works out for me, if this is like something that like is worth my time, you know, financially, like it's very attractive. I would say like you can make a lot of money in crypto, right? Like from being right, like about being in crypto. So like you have even that as a baseline is like very important, right? Because you can very easily justify and like to yourself, at the very least, that like, hey, I'm spending like a lot of time on learning about this industry. Uh, Obviously, like everything's like online, everything's on Twitter, and yeah, it's just very easy, I think, to come in and like post something, like engage with people. It's extremely open. And yeah, like you can really build a feedback loop around like learning about topics, asking questions, writing about stuff, sharing your thoughts, finding like-minded people. And they can honestly, like so many people have made it this way, and like many of the people I like respect the most kind of have come up in like similar ways. I think this is a playbook that works. It's probably working in other industries as well, right? But in crypto, it's really like tried and tested, and just very rewarding. Like this feedback loop of learning and writing and being on social media, and like just I don't know, even if you just go where kind of your interest takes you, right? Because crypto has kind of natural heartbeat in the sense where there's always things happening and there's a lot of entropy, there's like a lot of fun things happening, a lot of creative energy. Uh, and even if you just kind of let that like sweep over you and like then kind of cling to the stuff that's really interesting to you, maybe something happens and there's one aspect about it that you really want to learn more about and you just do that, but you do that consistently for a couple of years, you end up building a ton of like a really like broad kind of base of knowledge. And I think if you like, things will start to connect as well, right? Like you will start to see a lot of parallels and really build a kind of fabric of like where when you learn like about a certain primitive, like you see it used as a building block in like other things, and then that itself is like a building block in like yet another thing, and it's like really everything kind of starts to interconnect. And I think it like worked this way for me with security and or Bitcoin security. I think I have probably something like about it's a mix of like my character and the way that I think social media rewards controversy with attention and clout. Is that I mean, I'm like, when something big happens or like when there's a topic that people really don't want to talk about, like the more I want to talk about it, basically. Just like put your finger on kind of where it hurts. And for me, there were a bunch of topics like that in Bitcoin. I mean, the culture was another big one. I mean, there were so many like delusions in Bitcoin even back then. I mean, like stuff like the stock to flow ratio or stuff like that. It's just like, insane like mass delusions. And yeah, the security budget was it was interesting because it was like forbidden to talk about it, right? um, almost like you're in the, I don't know, like 1600 like church, Catholic church, and like or you're sensing that like the Earth is like secretly like the Earth is like secretly not the center of the universe, right? It's not the stars and like the sun don't revolve like around the Earth, but like the Earth revolves around the sun. And not only that, there's like many universes, and like many suns and like many Earths, and it's like complete like blasphemy, right? That's kind of the way that it felt. And like that was kind of in a lot of ways like reinforced, because when you were talking like in private to like very smart people, like really like core developers and stuff, and they were like, yeah, like I totally agree, but like I can't I can't say that in public. So it was really like this like complete like thought control, or like like at least like speech control, like in like public places. And I mean, so this was like the cultural side of things, like why I was really drawn to it. But then like from a fundamental perspective, like I didn't just say anything to like trigger people, like that really is a problem with Bitcoin security. And like it was back then, it's still today, right? I mean, my understanding or like how worried about it has changed, but like I would say like roughly the issue is that like Bitcoin security today comes from inflation. Inflation's going down. Fees are not growing. To kind of make up for that. And the underlying issue why that is there's no mechanism in Bitcoin that basically translates demand to use Bitcoin to security. And that's why if you have fees, then basically when you like transact in Bitcoin and there's like more demand for transacting, then there's supply in the blocks, then there's like competition and fees. But like most people don't use Bitcoin by transacting it, right? Like I hold a lot of Bitcoin, but I don't know that I've transacted with it maybe in like 3 to 4 years actually, right? Like I'm just holding, like, and I know like most other people, are just holding, right? So like we all use Bitcoin and we really benefit from Bitcoin and like the security that it provides, but we're not paying anything for it, right? So it's like really like all of us are just like free riding in a way on like the security that is provided I mean, today we are paying because there's inflation, right? But if you kind of play this out and there's only fees, then we really like free riding on the transaction fees that are being paid by those who like want to transact. And yeah, so
So maybe I can just give you a straw man here. Like, why do we
sure.
need security? If 51%, even like, yeah, why do we need security? I mean, people can't steal funds. They can only just like censor us. Like, what, can we get into this world where people can like altruistically mine? Like this term of
Mm-hmm.
security, like
Mm-hmm.
why does it even matter? Security sounds important, but help people that maybe don't understand like the importance of it.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, security is basically it's like money staked on like the longest chain. Like I think that's like roughly how you can think about it. And if like there's not a lot of like proof of work, quote unquote, like staked on securing like a particular version of the chain or a particular version of history, then that that like version of the chain or that state becomes like very fragile. And like when that happens, maybe you David, send me some money. But I know there's not, you send me that money now, and I know that, you know, that transaction is not particularly final, right? So I know that if the chain, was to be reorganized, then you could take your money back from me. You could spend it back to yourself, or you could spend it to someone else, right? And that is the real problem, right? Like Bitcoin has value only in this, to the degree that like people see the transactions that are being made as final. Like finality is like, if not the central property, like in any payment system, basically. And so, maybe I'm not really worried if you like, pay me like a couple $100. But if you're like sending like $1 million or like $10 million or like $1 billion, right? Then that becomes like a really big impediment basically to like receiving funds and like seeing them as final, right? And this, by the way, like you're building a layer two, like this is absolutely true also for like layer twos. Like if someone if somebody wants to deposit like from layer one to the layer two, or like from another layer two to another layer two, like the layer two that receives the funds needs the absolute assurance that like these funds are final, right? Because otherwise they can't issue some kind of representative token of that BTC on the layer two, without risking that this money is actually like unbacked, right? Because it's then later being double spent on the layer one. And so finality is extremely important. Without without fees or without inflation, like without quote unquote like security budget, there's no like security or like no proof of work stacked on the longest chain, and without that, it's like easier to reverse the longest chain for anyone who wants to. And yeah, so I mean, there absolutely are like different solutions like around that. They just come with like quite different trade-offs, right? And so one that like Ethereum has chosen, like Ethereum, for example, has inflation plus fee burn. And so what that means, there's like an amount of inflation per year. Like right now, I think maybe that's like 1%, maybe. I think base inflation, let's just call it that. And then you have, fees that are being paid to use the protocol are actually burned. And so when nobody uses the chain, then like, the net inflation is 1%, right? When the chain, when there's maybe good amount of fees burned, then that can even exceed the amount that's being created in inflation. So the chain can still be like net deflationary, right? And so this is like, I think, I think hands down, this is like the best design that exists. Why? Because it basically ensures that inflation pays for security, but only when there's not enough fees basically to secure the network, right? So I think if you were to like make a network from scratch, or like you're not like, you don't have a social contract that maybe says like, oh, we need to like, have like 21 million coins, then you can do that. I think in Bitcoin, like it's very unlikely we're ever going to see something like that. Like you can have stuff like that works like similar and is like within the $20 million coin limit by just like having people's balances like decrease, right? Like very slightly, kind of every year, like in their wallet. Like you can have that. That's not hard. to do. I mean, do I think that's like very likely for Bitcoin? No, not really. I think you can also, I mean, you can have, the protocol can set transaction fees. It can't do it in a naive way, like, I mean, so there's two problems with that. Like right now, the fees are basically like set by the market, right? Like, basically people compete in like a first price auction, like how much they want to pay for like every like unit of whatever compute in Bitcoin. Um, you can put that like on its head as well. Like the protocol itself can charge, decide what fee it wants to charge. With a caveat, two caveats basically. Like one, it doesn't really solve the underlying problem that like most users of Bitcoin don't really like transact on chain, right? Like they just get a lot of value out of by holding it, like, and you don't really ever like charge those users. So you still only like rely on people wanting to transact, and that might not be enough, right? And then the second problem with that basically is that if you just have the money go to the like next miner, then they can basically just pay it back to the user. They can say, well, the protocol is charging you, I don't know, like $100, but if you transact with me, then you can pay 50. I'm gonna kick you back the other 50. Like you have to avoid that, so you need to kind of pay the money into like a communal pool and then pay the miners like an inflationary reward from like the communal pool that's like spread out over like many blocks to kind of avoid this like kickback system. Although really it's still hard to avoid because people can like kick back like the communal reward over like a longer period of time. It's like really tricky. I think what is like the most likely scenario, and I say that, I mean, I would say like, unfortunately, is probably that it more devolves into something like what you mentioned. Like I mean, you called it like, what did you call it? Like
Like
voluntary mining?
altruistic mining,
Altruistic mining.
altruistic. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, like, like it's never going to be altruistic in the sense that, like, oh, you have like a lot of people who really care about Bitcoin, they love it so much, and they will like mine on their phone or whatever. Like, that's not going to happen. But it's more so. Uh, I mean, already today we have only like a small number of mining pools and like a small number of like publicly listed like Bitcoin mining companies that own like most of the hash rate. Uh, what I think more is like, this trend is going to continue. So like mining power is going to centralize. Um, and, also like governments start caring about crypto more. And like, now we have seen, US government reserve, holding Bitcoin and giving it like the rubber stamp, which is like a reserve asset and it's like digital gold. And sure, like you can absolutely see that kind of become a trend. Like more governments start to hold Bitcoin, and then they care about the Bitcoin network like running, right, and like having that finality, right? Because without that finality, Bitcoin is like quite worthless. And so, maybe you don't really see like the government mining Bitcoin, but maybe you see more like, it basically becomes like quote unquote like POA chain in the sense where you have these like five mining companies and they really don't spend a lot of money on it. But it's like effectively it's like, well, if any of them like were to reorg or, uh, then it's just like you go to prison, right? Like basically Bitcoin like reorganizing becomes like illegal, right? But then, I mean, effectively at this point you also have to ignore like other miners who are like not from that pool, right? Because like North Korea can easily buy like a lot of kind of written down mining hardware, right? And like, I mean, we see in Ethereum they are willing to spend like a ton of money on like very elaborate hacks and attacks on crypto. Like they can totally like also buy whatever like $100 million of like crypto mining hardware and like burn that on attacking the chain, right? So I mean, difficult decisions will have to be made in that future, right? Like
Yeah.
either uh, like the money to pay for like stacking like proof of work on the longest chain, either has to come from somewhere, or you basically get rid of like the proof of work and you say, it's okay, we don't need a lot of proof of work on the longest chain. We can secure this like with legal contracts and stuff, but then you effectively need to make the system close to like new entrants, right? Because the way that proof of work works is anybody can bring online new hash rate from anywhere in the world and start mining. And so this very quite fundamental property of Bitcoin, right, then will have to give, right? And so um,
Yeah.
that's, yeah, I mean, I would say like, I mean, we can also talk about the case where the transaction fees will be enough, right? And like, maybe we develop like a lot of use cases where people start using Bitcoin on chain, maybe due to like having many layer twos, and then there will be transaction fees. And I would say this, I I think there's a like decent chance also that this will happen, maybe like 30-40% or something. But it's just not guaranteed, right? And I think the like what really like always stood out to me is how Bitcoiners are very paranoid and pride themselves on having like really long-term thinking about the protocol and like caring about like long-tail risks. And this is like not a long-tail risk. This is like a fat-tail risk that is
Mm.
just like illegal, quote unquote, to talk about, right? And so like I'm very happy if like the risk never materializes, but I think it's important that like people admit that it is a risk. It's like
Definitely.
this is like a flaw in the way that Bitcoin was designed, and it's like from a time when maybe Satoshi was thinking, well, Bitcoin is like a digital cash system. We're gonna have millions of transactions. Also, we're gonna scale Bitcoin blocks, so actually like millions of people can transact on chain, and then each of them will only pay like a couple cents, maybe. Maybe I think that might have been his idea, right? And then it's fine. Like in this world, where people use maybe Bitcoin for payments, it all would have been okay. But that's not the world where we're kind of moving. Like I personally think there was no need for like an online like Bitcoin as a cash system. That's like not a very interesting or like use case that would have attracted anywhere like near kind of the same amount of attention. So I think Bitcoin as digital gold is like much more interesting, but then the system and the way that it was designed is not really like optimal to kind of handle that.
Yeah. So let me step in here and try to recap because I think we covered a lot. So to recap, you're saying that there was this kind of mass delusionment in Bitcoin around this kind of security budget, and this is a problem because without security, we lose censorship resistance and finality, and
Mhm.
if we lose that, then we really kind of lose the core revolution, and we might as well just go home. So you mentioned like two possible solutions in the Ethereum landscape. It's kind of like you have this fee burn. So my first question is, do you think that this is creating this like parasitic tension in Ethereum where it's kind of like, okay, do you want the activity and the fees to happen on the L1 or do you want to push it to L2? And if they happen on L2, then you're getting less of a burn and you're increasing the inflation. And then more specifically related to Bitcoin, it's like you mentioned L2s potentially being a solution to the security budget. Like, do you see what we're building, ZK rollups, as something that can credibly actually like reverse your opinion on like the disillusionment we had around Bitcoin security budget?
Okay. On the first question, whether I mean this makes the politics more complicated, basically, is right. I understood your question. I think the answer is no. I mean, like in Ethereum, Ethereum is just like more ahead of chains like Bitcoin and Solana in like many of these like developments. And so you're kind of seeing debates come to a head that like will exist in every ecosystem. Like, play out another like 10 years in Bitcoin and fees are much lower and like more people are saying, well, security maybe really is a problem. And the layer twos even are saying, well, this is a problem. We can't really see these deposits as final. It takes like 12 hours for someone to deposit to our chain. Like this sucks. People don't want to use it. Um, or like we and I mean in this world, you will have people say, maybe more stuff should happen on the layer one. Maybe it shouldn't happen on the layer two. The layer twos are taking the fees away from the layer one, and it's killing Bitcoin. It's taking our security budget, right? Like totally a debate that you can see like a couple years down the road. Um, that said, there is a complication where what a fee burn basically makes. Well, it basically makes like every holder of ETH, or like imagine it was BTC, and every holder of BTC makes it like a holder of the chain in the sense not just the asset but like the network, right? Like if I'm holding BTC, if like more people are using like Bitcoin for transactions and apps, etc., like It's not that much of a clear kind of connection between those things. But in Ethereum, if like I'm an ETH holder and like, we get like a lot of stable coins and like other use cases, like real world use cases built on Ethereum, then I'm benefiting from that, right? Because I'm like an equity holder in the network, right? And I'm getting effectively paid a dividend by the network if like a lot of people use it. And so I think that is cool, but it does introduce, I mean, when you give people the option to like make money, then they will, want to make more money. And if they make money one year and then next year they don't, they will ask, where's my money, right? And I think in Ethereum is partially like what you're seeing, right? I think much of it like over indexing on, I think ETH as money and like, yeah, this is like whatever. I can't even remember what it was called, like ultrasound money and all of this bullshit. And not enough, focus on like Ethereum as like a dominant technology platform for computing. And that's kind of what you get, right? Like fees are moving. Maybe there's like one year one use case is like very popular, and another year it's on another chain, and like now they are owning our fees, etc. And if only we didn't have L2s, I mean, it's all of like none of this stuff is like really like true. But it does create a bigger like surface basically for people to fight about. And like, I mean, it's just like politicking and like distraction in a lot of ways. I mean, we would have that in Bitcoin if there were ever any like real debate about maybe changing the way that like the inflation works or like who the fees go to, etc. Because then you're touching like the miners' income, right? Like, and so right now it's just the miners getting the fees, right? It's not like nobody's getting the fees in Bitcoin. It's just the miners getting the fees. Plus, there aren't that many fees, right? So it's not that like important maybe to talk about. So it's not that political. But in Ethereum there were like a lot of fees, and so people cared more, I would say, right? And then the second question was if ZK rollups are gonna change that. I
Yes.
mean, so I think the answer is maybe. I mean, so fundamentally, like what ZK rollups don't change, like there's no way again to like magically start charging Bitcoin holders, right? Like the fundamental problem with all of this is that it's like Bitcoin doesn't charge Bitcoin holders, and like holding is the number one way of actually using Bitcoin. It doesn't change that at all. What it does change is ZK rollups will create more use cases or more ways for using Bitcoin that go beyond holding Bitcoin, right? So like more ways to use it productively. So whether maybe it's in trading or like in some kind of like Tornado Cash like privacy mixer, lending and borrowing, like basically a lot of things that like people go to like centralized exchanges for right now, I think. I think there's not that many things that like people are going to use Bitcoin for, and like we can get into that in the future, like later in the episode. But there are a few use cases that are really, really massive. Like those use cases are like important enough that you can build like an insanely valuable chain or like network based on them. Like even today, like even before like any, Bitcoin is like really quote unquote like mass adopted by governments and sovereign wealth funds and all those things. And so, yeah,
Yeah. So, okay. So I think I see your position here that you're saying ZK rollups could create fee revenue in the future for Bitcoin, but it cannot guarantee this security. It can't guarantee this perpetual fees are available, and that's kind of why maybe you need to explore having some sort of inflation that can be charged when you don't have fees to ensure that security is always there. So I think that makes sense. What if we had maybe let's pivot to MEV? Like, what if we had the reverse problem? Like, what if somehow we added more functionality to Bitcoin layer one, or ZK rolls became huge, and now there's like gargantuan amounts of revenue that can be extracted via MEV. Like, what is your position on MEV in Bitcoin?
yeah. So for those not familiar with MEV, I mean, it's basically, I mean, the original definition is basically it's money that can be extracted by the party that's ordering, like from like basically like reordering or like including or excluding like transactions in in like the block. And so like very naively, like, I mean, an easy example is like if two people want to like, make the same trade to get like this $100 opportunity, then like both of them, like the value for like for anyone to get this opportunity is like $100, and they will like pay it. They will like bribe whoever is the block producer that amount to like get the opportunity, right? And so there will be like economic opportunities on chain translate into a specific ordering that is basically created through like bribes in like the best case, and like direct like integration in the worst case. And so what do I mean by that? So there's two like key dimensions to understand about MEV. One is basically like, what does this mean for users and apps? And so this is basically, a chain with a lot of MEV basically is like very shitty to use for users, right? Like the idea that if you have an AMM where, on the user side, every transaction is going to be public, and like you're going to be front run like all of the time, right? Like you're making a, Bitcoin is trading at like 80,000, and so you're saying, well, I want to buy it exactly 80,000. Okay, but then what happens is like, oh, somebody traded ahead of you, and oh, your transaction failed. Well, good luck, try again in 30 minutes, right? Just like terrible UX. Or the alternative is, oh, let me actually set my slippage tolerance to like 81,000. Well, okay, now I do that. So maybe someone traded ahead of me, but I can still get included in the same block, right? But then what happens now is like some sandwich bot comes in and they see, your slippage tolerance, and they just like buy in the AMM ahead of you. They push up the price, make you buy at 81,000, and then they sell back into the AMM and like make a nice profit. Basically, the exact like delta between like what you overpaid, like they basically made a profit. And so it's like a terrible user experience. On the other side, you may have an AMM, and like, well, it's like all of this passive liquidity. It's like people put in money and they attach like some market making strategy to it. Maybe like, XY equals K or something more bespoke. But the gist is that like, if you have, a chain, if you have any chain, any AMM really, then what's going to happen is like, well, every time a new block happens, like your price is going to be like slightly stale, right? Like maybe it's too high, too low, right? And then somebody can basically come and trade in the pool and like buy from you, and like every time you're basically being like rebalanced, like against your will, and you're basically being picked off, like quoting like a bad trade, right? And so the one thing is like really bad for users, the other thing is like really bad for market makers, which also is bad for users because the market makers will like end up quoting like much like wider spreads, and like put in much less liquidity. And so like MEV is just bad for like any kind of DeFi ecosystem to develop on a chain. And so what you want is want to develop like a transaction supply chain that is like resistant to MEV. Like it basically is like, it protects applications and users from MEV, and like returns that value, like it prevents that value from leaking in the first place. And the value that like quote unquote like has to leak because it's very hard to prevent, like that is basically like internalized and like given back to apps and users in like an incentive compatible way. That is kind of the first perspective. The second perspective is as a chain itself, right? So I mean, we said like, well, finality is really important, censorship resistance is really important if you're a chain. But like, what happens if like one miner it's just like, they might make like much more profit than everybody else. This is in some way, it's like a mirror of the situation we talked about before, where, maybe, the security budget is really low and somebody is like much more ruthless than somebody else, right? Like they can, just launch like quote unquote a cheap attack because maybe there's no legal recourse against them and they can like double spend or whatever. And, the same, can be said here. Maybe you have like, I don't know, like Citadel or like Jump Trading or whatever, like, they all of a sudden are like the biggest Bitcoin miner. Why? Because they can make more money doing it, because they can extract that MEV much better than someone else can. Like maybe then, I don't know, who else is there? Ocean, maybe. I don't know. I'm not familiar with who the top Bitcoin mining pools are. But like, this is obviously something to avoid. And so from the perspective of the chain, you want two things. Like you want MEV to be minimized because that is what's better for the DeFi ecosystem on top and for your users. And so every chain is competing with every other chain and every also non-chain, like centralized exchanges and so on. They compete on providing like a good product to users, right? And so I want to minimize MEV wherever I can. So every chain wants to minimize MEV. Not all MEV can be minimized. I mean, partially because there's like some things that are more like fundamental, and there's some things we don't really have the technology quite yet to like build the systems that would like allow us to make a good app and still like prevent MEV extraction. And so let's say there's like some MEV that really like can't be extracted. That can't be prevented. So we want this to be extracted in a democratic way. And so what this means is like we know we want like finality and such, on like we want like the mining game to be like fair, right? And so we don't want one miner to be more powerful than everybody else because that's not going to go very well. And so we make sure that like the infrastructure to extract the MEV is actually open and it is accessible to all the mining pools, and then all the mining pools can run it basically, and everybody can like make roughly kind of the same profit, right? And so this is what the company where I work, Flashbots, we are the kind of, the original like researchers behind Flashbots. They basically first discovered or like wrote about MEV as a concept, and then also developed a solution to this, which is a public MEV auction. It was like a sidecar that like the mining pools can run, connected to like a centralized relay. The relay ran like the auction for like what like transactions basically should like make it into the block, and then the mining pools could receive those transactions to like, and they can like construct their block template in like a centralized, like in a kind of sidecar that they run locally. And it didn't require any trust from the perspective of the mining pool, although like it required trust in like from the searchers and users in the mining pool, right? And so this, like today our software is like much evolved, but I'm like back when it was still like in proof of work days, that's how it used to work. And so I think that's like the general perspective on kind of MEV. I forgot where I was going with this. What was your question?
Yeah, well, maybe we just push forward. So it sounds like there's two issues that MEV creates. One is just
Yeah.
for the user experience. It either
Right.
causes more failure of transactions or it leads to worse pricing. The second is this idea of like minor centralization. So on the first issue, maybe are you able to give like tangible examples of like ways that apps or chains can be designed to minimize MEV extraction and possibly redistribute it? And then where I want this conversation to go is for Bitcoin specifically, is there indication that MEV will actually bleed down to the miners, or will it be captured by the sequencer and this is a non-issue for Bitcoin?
Yeah. The latter. Like, there's no indication that there will be any. I think that there will be like meaningful amounts of MEV on layer one. Like, we know like theoretically, but also empirically, because rollups exist now for a long time in Ethereum, that like MEV doesn't really bleed down. Like, the ordering of the layer two is determined at the layer two by the layer two sequencer, and so that's where that MEV is extracted. The only like situation where there was any MEV in Bitcoin on layer one was if you had some kind of application ecosystem on layer one. But it's honestly like it's very hard to imagine a worse base layer for like to host applications on than Bitcoin. Just because it doesn't have finality, it is extremely slow, and it's not very programmable, right? So you will have like very kind of poor and like very like unexpressive transactions that will take like hours to use. It's just like you can't make like a good product on that people won't, where the same product won't be much better on like a centralized exchange or on a layer two. And so I would say, like, if anybody is thinking about building a kind of exchange on Ethereum layer one or whatever, like an AMM, just don't do it, right? It doesn't make any sense, really.
Yeah, I think that's actually a major reason why I think people push back against like Opcat, which could give us a native ZK verifier, is that it could enable like very clunky ways to create AMMs. And if people had AMMs on Bitcoin layer one, they could to the MEV arbitrage, and that it can create, the term they use is like different modes of MEV. But I think what you're saying is what I resonate with well, where it's like even if you could build this stuff 10-minute block times with no clear finality, with terrible wallet and user experience, with like the block size limits, it's hard to think that even if you could create these contraptions on Bitcoin layer one, that they could gain sufficient size to actually make the MEV material. Um,
Yeah.
so it sounds like you're aligned with that
100%.
view.
Yeah. I mean, like 1,000%. Like, yeah, I think this is a very bad argument against something like Opcat. Like, I mean, we can get into like what my kind of preferred endgame of like Bitcoin would be. Like, sure, like we can do that later. But I mean, like Bitcoin is like right now, like it's not yet like programmable enough, right? Like you can make like a kind of janky like rollup, but like rollups will not unfold like their full potential until it's like better to like it's you can actually make like rollups actually trustless, and you can make it more gas efficient to settle to the layer one, etc. Like Bitcoin still needs to change for sure at the layer one.
Hmm.
Like it wants to have actual functional rollup ecosystem. And that will entail that, well, you can also like you can not only build like the quote unquote good stuff on Bitcoin. Like some people will build really dumb stuff on Bitcoin layer one with the tools that are available, but that doesn't mean that anybody will use them, right? Like you really can't make a good like decentralized exchange on Bitcoin layer one that will get a lot of traction, that will get so big that like MEV becomes a problem. Like I guarantee you that like like $1 billion to one. Like uh, and even if it does, like you know MEV, if it's democratized properly and we know how to do that, like this is a solved problem. Like uh, it's not a concern.
And
Like
when you're saying democratize MEV, you're saying basically open source something like Flashbots for Bitcoin,
exactly,
or do you
just
mean
like
something
make it
different?
accessible to like all the miners, basically. Yeah, like make sure that
Okay,
extraction happens in a way that like so all the miners make the same return from it.
got
That
it.
isn't.
Okay, and then you gave a nice little segue here to like a possible end game for Bitcoin. Like, what is Hasu's perfect end game for Bitcoin? Maybe both on the kind of the protocol level, infrastructure level, and then also
Mm.
go into what you think those few apps are. You said there's few and far between apps, but a few that could be
Mm.
grand slams.
Yeah. Well, at least for now. Yeah. What's my end game? Okay, like the one thing we already touched upon. Like, I mean, Bitcoin layer one needs to become more programmable. Like, I mean, I think the like high priests of Bitcoin have tried for a long time to like keep all the programmability out of Bitcoin, but somehow like some crazy scientists have found a way to like get it through the keyhole, like like somehow find a way like through the keyhole anyway. And now we have like some notion of programmability in Bitcoin, but it's very janky, right? Like you're building on it, like so it would be nice to have like simpler constructions, right? Like the same thing that you're doing, but like simpler and like with even less trust required, right? And so at the very least, like the ability to like verify, you know, ZK proofs and stuff, like on chain. I mean, this transactions are also like huge otherwise, and it's like so we need programmability, right? We need like two things. So we need like two changes at least to the layer one. Like we need better programmability, and this can be done in a like very conservative way, but like it needs to happen. Otherwise, this is going to be very bad for the rollup ecosystem and for its adoption. The second thing is we need bigger blocks. And this one is just a complete no-brainer, like because the like resources like compute and storage and DA is just like getting cheaper every year, every year, every year. Like Bitcoin blocks are like the same size as they were maybe like 8 years ago. And right now nobody cares, but like when people use rollups and you have like transactions going back and forth, depositing, withdrawing, going from one rollup to the next, and also maybe rollups. I assume they're going to post also their data to, maybe to the Bitcoin layer one. So anybody can like, get the inputs, for example, to the ZK proof, right? To kind of see that actually like this is like using like the correct inputs or whatever. Like we just need more storage. Like we know from we know from chains like Ethereum, like what a good base layer for rollups looks like. Bitcoin can learn from these things and like try to kind of gently like move towards that. The one other thing that maybe I would put in this bracket is just like better finality. Like I don't yet know how we would do this, but like I mean, the way that like I think it's like a proof of work thing. Like just the way that proof of work works is just like finality is created like incrementally, right? Like there's one block and then another block that's building on it, etc. And there's never, I mean, like you need almost in a sense like you need like the network signing off on like saying like, oh, at this point like the quote unquote like there's enough proof of work and now the transaction is actually final. And then it can't be reversed. Like the network just won't allow it, right? So some kind of, I mean, call it checkpointing or whatever, right? Like, but like there's this amount of work, like it must be checkpointed, like it can't be rolled back. And like, why does this matter? It matters because the rollups they need finality on the layer 1 so they can honor deposits to the layer 2. And if it takes a really long time to get finality on the layer 1, it becomes very hard, right? To have a good user experience. Like people optimally like, I mean, they would like to make a transaction. I mean, but the centralized exchanges have the same problem, right? But like maybe a centralized exchange is like a little bit easier even kind of to deal with this problem than for the rollups. So I think if you start to have a rollup ecosystem on Bitcoin, right? Maybe you have like 3-4 rollups and they all have like some moderate amount of usage and it's becoming like the pride of Bitcoin and everybody is excited. I think there will be more of a kind of move in that direction where people say, well, what do we need to make these rollups really successful because it's very good for Bitcoin? Well, yeah, it's going to be programmability, it's going to be bigger blocks, it's going to be like faster finality, maybe even like faster blocks like in general, because that will also help. And yeah, so those are like 3 big ones. For the layer 2s, actually chatted about this with John like earlier, and we both were like, yeah, it would be good if there was more privacy in Bitcoin. Like you're never gonna have this on the layer 1, that ship has said, but like you can have it on layer 2, right? Like you can have it also in a much better way. Like you can have like like rollups that are like just fundamentally like like Tornado Cash, quote unquote, like rollups where like your BTC is like part of a shielded pool and like you can use like the apps and stuff. And it's like we are starting to kind of learn how to do these things. And so there's a technical challenge, like we want to have that. But then there's also like the social and like the legal side of things, right? Like a lot of people don't really use privacy solutions, even in Ethereum, because they are trained that, well, for example, I use like Tornado Cash and like Binance closed my account. Like I can no longer like use like the biggest exchange in crypto, right? Like that's bad, right? Like that's how you basically like deter people from using any privacy solution. And so we need like a more of a shift in terms of thinking, well, it's not really okay, to move money like and have like your bank account posted like online, right? It's like it's not great, right? So I think there is a window of time where we have the opportunity to like normalize privacy in DeFi and like on layer 2s and make that kind of like legally acceptable and like adopt it to the point where it's like encryption like online. Or like, I mean, even like your credit card payment is also encrypted, right? Like there can still be like ways to prove that like you didn't do any like money laundering and stuff, but like we need better privacy at least than we have now. Like right now it's just terrible. And like I wouldn't use it for a lot of things that I would use it for if I had privacy. And then
Yeah.
well, yeah. No,
No,
go
no,
ahead.
no. Please finish.
Just the final thing is just, I mean, we need to talk about like the security, right? Like because it's just a tricky problem. I don't have a solution, but like this could become a problem. Like in the future, if like Bitcoin layer 1 doesn't have like good finality anymore, this puts the whole stack of things that is built on top of it also into question. And like we would, I think, very much like to avoid that. Also like to avoid the situation where like Bitcoin is just like becomes like a POA chain run by like 3 governments and like whatever, BlackRock. And, it's like wrapped in a kind of legal system. And, like it's not gonna be maybe, I think, what people were like hoping, Bitcoin could become at this point. And so, yeah, I mean, if I have to give you like a list of, those would be like my top 5, I would say.
Okay. The three that I want to focus on here and just get quick follow-up points on are one, the DA size, or like the block size. I do probably agree with you that we could and maybe should increase the block size, but how do you determine what is the right amount? Because no amount of block size will ever be sufficient. Like Bitcoin's never going to have mammoth Celestia style 1 GB blocks. And so if you actually run the analysis, which we've done, you could technically fit all of the current transaction volume of the top 10 rollups in Ethereum ecosystem. You could fit that on Bitcoin DA. Granted, that's maxing everything out and fees would go high, but I
Yeah.
think the block sizes are surprisingly bigger than people think. So first question is, what do you think is the right size for the for like a block size increase? And then on finality, on the rollups, like we could use something like Babylon to create economically secured finality for the rollup. Do you think that's sufficient or inadequate?
Okay, so the second one first. Well, I mean, you can have a layer 2 sequencer, and they can use something like Babylon to basically, commit to a certain. They commit to a certain ordering on the layer 2 and basically say that this is the ordering that I'm going to post to the layer 1. So this is kind of final, right? So you can use it for that. I mean, you can't use it on the layer 1, right? Because on the layer 1, you never know, who the next miner is going to be, right? So, you would need future miners basically using Babylon and saying, I'm going to whatever, like respect that ordering. And that you can't really do that, right? Because Bitcoin mining is permissionless. And so like fundamentally speaking, you can't solve the problem through like kind of on top like staking gadget. I think it's just fundamentally impossible. On the bigger blocks, I mean, my approach would just be like you have to ask what properties you want out of Bitcoin, right? Like maybe you want you have like a certain hardware and like bandwidth like spec in mind, right? That you want for like running a Bitcoin full node. Because you're saying, well, this is like, the kind of type of PC and like geography that we want to support. And like, yeah, self custody, everything is like very important. So we want to retain that ability. Like if you have a MacBook, whatever, like you should be able to run a Bitcoin full node, right? And without it crashing like your computer, right? So, but you need to like decide something, right? Like you need to set some target and then that becomes like your constraint. And so you just optimize the overall system within those constraints, right? So you know that then at that point you can run like simulations or whatever. And you can like figure out like, well, what is the biggest amount of block, like DA and like block size that we can still like that is still within like the tolerance of this constraint that we set on the system. And
I see.
that is totally like, I mean, a social like debate that must be had, right, between like, I mean, the community and like the core developers.
Yeah. Okay. So on the block size, that makes sense that we can kind of run the analysis and say, hey, we can gradually increase block size. Things have changed from where they were 10 years ago. And then on the finality, I think you're saying because Bitcoin layer 1, it doesn't have like the look ahead, so to speak, that Ethereum has. Like you can't get assurance as to like which validator or miner is up next to include blocks. Therefore, it's harder to get this, single slot
Yeah, I
finality.
mean, every miner adds like some amount of finality, right? Like every block
You're right.
built adds like some proof of work, and that proof of work adds like some finality, right? But a you can't like okay, so imagine like instead of just a proof of work, we are attaching a proof of work and a transaction that is a reference to like that basically says like, hi, I'm David and I'm like staking like $1 million on this chain, like on Babylon on this block, whatever, like
Mm.
not because reorgs, right? But then the way that like Bitcoin consensus works is that the next like if another miner wants to reorg you, then they only have to reorg like the proof of work side of things, right? They just have to make a more valuable proof of work to reorg you. They don't have to make a more valuable stake more money on Babylon, right? Like so you would be very silly to do that because you would lose all your money. You would get slashed because you're like whatever you did is not actually part of the Bitcoin consensus, you know? It's only part of like a social consensus maybe between miners on top, but then at any time like a new miner can come in that just ignores the social consensus and like reorg it anyway. And so if you want to add like staking to Ethereum layer 1, you have to do it in consensus. You can't do it out of consensus.
Okay, okay. And then the third topic that you brought up was privacy. So, like you mentioned things like Tornado Cash. I mean, have you looked into other, privacy preserving protocols like, our cryptographer Liam made shielded CSV? Are you familiar with that? Is that kind of in line with what you were referring to that would be
No.
beneficial for Bitcoin to have?
Can you like explain how it works? I wasn't familiar with it.
Sure. CSV is basically instead of having a global state, if you and I are transacting, we're basically just uh, sending the transactions in like the state history between ourselves. So the way that you verify it is on the client side as opposed to a global
Sure.
state.
Hmm.
The problem here is that state history just grows massively. So if you have transactions that you're sending, you have to basically check the provenance of the asset that you receive, and it just grows huge. Like it becomes insurmountable. So what you can actually do is you can, instead of sending the entire full history of the asset that you Hasu would check on your end, you just receive a zero knowledge proof that proves the validity of the history that there were
Hmm.
that these were all valid transactions. So you essentially get privacy for free. So this is a way to get like perfectly private payments without any sort of like mixers or Tornado Cash. It's just by default, because we're compressing the state history and just passing those client side, you get perfect privacy along with it.
Well, how many people can participate though?
Well,
Is it
I
like
guess
between many? Like, is it like many to many, or is it like one-to-one relationships?
It's one-to-one relationships, but not like a channels based approach. So like I would be sending you directly like a payment and of these assets or these coins, and you would just have a proof that proves the validity of it.
Yeah.
You only it's actually quite scalable. Like you only need to post these things called nullifiers like on the layer one to prevent double spends. But in my
Uh-huh.
opinion, it's kind of like the best implementation of privacy preserving protocol.
Well, I mean, okay, but then like somebody can still see from the outside that there's like some amount of money in like some amount of Bitcoin between like two people, right? Like they just don't know how much of that is owned by David and how much of that is owned by Hasu, right?
Mm. My understanding is no, that it's pretty much like radical privacy. But maybe I'll have to loop you in with Liam here and
Yeah,
before I say
maybe I
anything too
will
stupid.
talk to them. Yeah, I mean, if it's like one to one, I mean, basically, I think the use cases are like extremely limited, right? Because there's not many like payments where like encrypting, you know, where that's relevant. Like privacy comes from being part of a big set, right? Like you want to be part of like the same ZK proof where like maybe there's like like 1,000 Bitcoin in there, right? And like you own like 0.1 of it, and then it's really hard to trace, right? But like it's like, I mean, I need to look into it, but I think the solution is more probably in line with like what we've already seen, right? Like um, this is actually interesting. I mean, what we have seen is like stuff like Zcash, right? It's also entirely based on like client-side proving, right? Like client-side proving is like 100% like what you can do if you want. I mean, if you have like if you have local state, i.e. like UTXO, then you do client-side proving, right? Like so you can have like a fully like UTXO based network with client-side proving, where people just send like the proofs that my UTXO is like part of the UTXO set, right? Like so it's like a valid coin that I can spend. Like when you send me a coin, then you convince me that your coin is valid, basically, right? And we're all part of the same like shielded pool. Uh, the way that ZK Tornado Cash works is more you have like one big prover, I think, if I remember correctly, and people send like secrets to them that they have like the right to spend a coin, and it's like sent to someone else, etc. But I mean, this is an interesting cultural thing, uh, in the sense that this would be like one of my warnings to like people building on Bitcoin now. like if there's a famous like saying, like if you're making a startup, right? Like you're making, I don't know, whatever, any kind of new startup, don't try to reinvent the wheel on like, things that already work. In the sense of like, oh, don't try to invent a new way to do like HR or to do finance or to do marketing or whatever, right? Like, because there is like a playbook for that, and like you're already trying something that is extremely ambitious and hard, and you will need all of your time and attention on that and your energy, which is like, finding a new like, inventing like a new product and somehow getting that adopted, which like most startups fail even if they focus only on that, right? And I think there is a one of the risks in Bitcoin is to have like the kind of like not invented here kind of fallacy. I mean, that exists in Bitcoin like for a long time, right? Like very early on, folks were like, oh, if there's ever anything interesting invented in another ecosystem, we just take it for Bitcoin and like put it in the protocol. Like clearly that has like never happened. But I think like now is the time when like we can actually do that, right? And the difficulty with that is you must have like no pride. Like you can't be like too proud, right? Like you really must be like, yeah, like already building like a rollup on Bitcoin is very hard. We're doing something, that's very important for the world. Like, and for everything else, like we'll just do, what is proven to work elsewhere. And we try like to innovate only in the areas like where it matters. And so I'm not saying that like this applies to you, but I still remember when I was first talking about like Bitcoin layer twos with John, and like we were kind of getting excited about this as a category, I was, this is like many, many months ago, but I was like saying this as like an explicit like failure mode. One failure mode is like, that like, they will try to like home cook everything basically and just like ignore the learnings from like other ecosystems. And it will be very janky. And you know, one other one other failure mode was that DeFi and Bitcoin has like taken now like so long to develop that like my concern was that like who's left in Bitcoin like after like I don't know 6, 7, like 8 years of like brain drain where everybody wanted to do something interesting in Bitcoin. It was like either impossible, or they were kind of like driven out by the social layer, or they were like if they were very business minded, they probably like went to like Ethereum or some other chain where they can actually build it now instead of like chewing glass on Bitcoin, right? And like my concern was, you know, yes, this is like an insanely big and interesting market, and it's so good for the world if like Bitcoin finally becomes programmable and it gets its layer 2 and DeFi ecosystem, and there's so much potential. But like this, like how good is this like first like vintage of like Bitcoin builders gonna be? Because if those folks have been in Bitcoin for many years, like is it actually like are you actually like adversely like selecting against like the success of your own project in the sense that like maybe if they want to be commercially successful, they've already like left Bitcoin, and if they've left Bitcoin, maybe it's now hard to come back, and so maybe somebody needs to like pave the way for that. But I mean I have to say, like, I mean, when I met like the Alpen team, uh, you know, I didn't have any of those concerns. But I think it's very interesting to kind of look back maybe on like 9, 12 months ago when like some of this, or like even more maybe, when like this kind of started, like just what like my reservations were and like where we stand like about them now. Because yeah, like I'm very, very excited about this as a category.
Yeah. Okay. That gets me excited because I think you're actually you're a perfect example of this kind of reversal of the brain drain. I think many people see you as like a tier one researcher that was part of that brain drain that left Bitcoin, and now maybe not
Mm.
entirely, but like a little bit, you're opening that door back up and saying, "I'm back in Bitcoin."
Hmm.
And so, do you think the Overton window is shifting? Do you think there are more people aside from you and John and maybe the few other small people that we mentioned here that are starting to take Bitcoin more seriously, or do you think it's still people are hyper skeptical of this? Like, how big do you think this movement actually is?
I mean, I can only speak about the people I talk to, but I think they are very receptive to the idea of like to some Bitcoin. Um, I I wonder if it's more of a, oh, okay, maybe he was in Bitcoin, then he went to Ethereum, and now he's going back to Bitcoin. I mean, I think in a sense it is more of like a rising above the tribalism in a sense. I mean, it used to be a joke to say like crypto, not Bitcoin, whatever. But like, I mean, it really is like crypto, like not Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin in many ways is like in a category of its own because it has it is the first crypto asset that ever worked, and it's digital gold, and you don't need a second digital gold. But also, this market now is much bigger than just Bitcoin, right? And I mean, there's no better way to prove it than by like showing how much good stuff has been invented in other ecosystems that now Bitcoin can benefit from. So it's becoming really a very positive sum kind of like matching of like the cinematic universes of like Bitcoin and like the rest of crypto, where unlocking Bitcoin as like a trustless collateral is going to be huge for other ecosystems, and rollups and DeFi and like all of those things are going to be huge for Bitcoin as well. And it's I mean, the same brands that people are going to use, like on Bitcoin layer 2, is going to be the same things that like are successful on all the other chains already as well, right? I think there's going to be very few like net new apps. There maybe going to be some, but like stuff like you're not making like a better Uniswap, or you're not making like a better Aave. Like this stuff is like very hard, right? And so like Bitcoin will tremendously benefit from like all of the stuff that's already been built that we're now basically building a bridge between, and that is super bullish for the whole space.
So that brings up another question in my mind. It's like, where do you think the network effect in our industry will start to amass to? Like, do you think that if we have this ZK verification on Bitcoin, do you think most of the network effect will start accruing into these rollups that kind of inherit the consensus of Bitcoin? Or do you think people are willing to take on a slightly added trust assumption and go to where all of the existing ecosystem on Ethereum works? Basically, is it going to be just a very trust minimized version of BTC on Ethereum, or is it going to be an even higher security version that exists on Bitcoin rollups? Like, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so there's two things that I'm certain about. One, a lot of value will accrue at like the best money. I mean, it looks like that's going to be Bitcoin. So I mean, Bitcoin is already the most valuable crypto asset, so maybe not much is going to change there. But like, there's a very clear use case for that. The other one that I'm very sure about is a lot of value will accrue to the best apps. So like the Uniswap, Aves, whatever else, like your kind of the like DeFi apps that exist, and like some that do not yet exist, and like apps eventually that maybe go beyond DeFi as well. But like they will make a lot of value just because they are closest to the user, right? So the rules of like the the regular like business world are not going to be like put upside down by the fact that now there's like a new backend server in town. As in like blockchains, like from the perspective of those apps, blockchains really are like some kind of backend infrastructure that is, today in other ways users have like a blockchain or like a network centric like view, right? They see themselves as, oh, I have like some money on Ethereum, so oh, what apps can I use? Let me pick from those 5 apps to use my Ethereum on, right? And in the future, I mean, already today, but like in the future, very clearly, like people will just have like an app centric view. They will have, they will have like their money sitting with like a specific app, right? Like, maybe I have like some money deposited on Uniswap, to stick with that example, because maybe that's why I bought like my S&P 500 and like my Tesla stock. And so maybe that is just sitting there, right? It's like the equivalent of like on-chain brokerage, right? And then maybe I do want to now I want to, I don't know, like borrow against it, so I'm just like sending it to Aave, for example, right? Like, but like it's the idea that the idea of like a network will really disappear. It's really like more people will think about apps and like things they want to do. Maybe will be even like more crazy with like people have like agents doing stuff for them. Maybe that will be the interface. It's possible. But I think it's very unlikely that people will see themselves as like users of Ethereum, users of Bitcoin, yada yada. Like they will have the asset and they will have the app. I think those are the two very clear things. It is honestly very unclear right now in any of the between layers, like where and if value will accrue, right? I mean, like DA, execution, settlement, right? Like, and sequencing. Uh, it's it's hard to say. Like even I find it even in Ethereum, like a space that I'm watching like every day. I find it very hard to say. But I mean, it's not clear to me in this world also where like the chain is becoming kind of abstracted away from the user. Why there should be like a ton of network effect in like one chain ecosystem, right? Like it used to be very clear because when a user has a chain centric ecosystem, then that means that being on this chain is very valuable, right? So I'm going where the user has their money because that's the only apps they even considering using, right? And they are used to this experience. But when it's taking like 2 seconds to like beam money from like one app to another across different chains, which is gonna be the case in the future, then I don't care what chain I'm on. Like the app will make sure that like I'm using a chain that's like secure, right? Like it's kind of their responsibility. But yeah, I find it very hard to imagine that there will be this kind of huge network effect for different chains that like people were envisioning. It's more they will
Mm.
more blend into the background.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that thesis around the asset and the application rather than the chain. So we are coming up on time here. I want to make sure I leave a minute or two here. Is there any other topic that you were kind of wanting to cover or discuss, or should we, put a wrap on this?
Well, if you want, we can talk a little bit about like staking and stuff in Bitcoin.
I would love
Um,
that.
yeah, sure.
So
Well,
yeah, give your hot takes here. I mean, staking is like a very popular big topic in Bitcoin right now, but from my perspective, it's definitely not the same as what we're able to see in Ethereum. So yeah, let's hear lay of the land.
sure. Yeah, I mean, so like staking as a concept is like where you put up some money as like, a bond that you make like some kind of economic commitment against, right? Like, so you're saying if you're a staker, if you're like in proof of stake, you're saying, well, I'm putting up this money, and if I like sign a block, then I'm basically saying that I'm going to only sign this block. And like I'm not in the future going to sign another block, or I'm not signing two blocks at the same block height, right? But if you find me doing those things anyway, you can slash me. That's staking, right? And this can be generalized. Like, I mean, we were already talking about the use case. You can have, Bitcoin on whatever Babylon, and like you can have Alpen, and you have a sequencer, and the sequencer makes some kind of economic commitment to a stake that they have on Babylon. Like that is also a form of staking, right? And like, what do you gain out of this? Well, you gain that maybe people trust your sequencer more, like the finality of the layer two before it has finality on layer one. Like that's a real economic value. So staking as a concept makes sense. Staking as an economic activity has a supply and demand side. The supply side is everybody wants to stake. And like, what do they get out of it? Well, yield, right? Maybe. And the demand side is, well, what types of those applications that I was talking about, where somebody wants to make some kind of economic commitment against something, exist, right? And in proof of stake, it's very clear. Like the whole consensus of the chain is like based on this one economic commitment. So you have a very natural market for staking. Right? It's literally like the staking market. And so in Bitcoin, well, frankly, you just don't have any of that, right? Like there's no applications that I can think of that would require Bitcoin staking. I mean, the example that you gave, well, I mean, securing layer two sequencers, yeah, we haven't really seen that on rollups. Like users don't really care that like sequencers stake. They could, like, it's fine, but it's probably not going to be a big use case. I mean, even staking like a small amount of money is probably fine, right? Even if you stake like $10 million, it's like enough for users probably, right? And so it's not going to be like a big market or anything. Some people, so I mean, if you're like, if you've heard about restaking, like what that means is basically someone is staking, but there are so many ways to use your stake. They say, oh, I want to, use it for like staking Ethereum, and I also want to use it to stake it somewhere else at the same time. There's two ways of doing that. One, I mean, if you have like a liquid staking token, it's like a liquid representation of your stake. Then you can just put that token somewhere, and that's also like can stake that liquid staking token. So that's already like restaking. Um, or there's like more complicated like contraptions, like what Eigenlayer is doing. And who can benefit from that? Well, I mean, it's like, and again, anybody who wants to make some type of economic commitment, but they don't like have a token of their own, maybe, or they don't know like where they should get the people from to do that. So if they also want like operators, maybe for a certain job. But I think what we have seen is, I mean, in Ethereum, it's like the demand for restaking is like on the supply side is like very big. Why? Because it's no risk today. There's no slashing or anything. It's no extra work. And so a lot of people want to do it. There also used to be like a lot of points and like airdrops given. So a lot of people deposited in restaking. Well, in practice, like the demand to use it, like on the demand side for apps, it's like practically zero. Like there's no demand whatsoever. And so, I mean, what can we conclude from that maybe for Bitcoin? Well, I think, is it like an asset problem? Like, is the problem that like, well, maybe the next rollup or the next app doesn't want, its thing secured by Ethereum? Would the demand be like 100x if it was Bitcoin? Well, maybe. I don't know. Probably not, right? Like economic security is economic security. I mean, can it be like an alignment thing where maybe people there's like Bitcoin staking to like signal some kind of like community thing? Maybe also, but yeah, hard to say. Well, I think the gist is I am like not very bullish on this as a use case. I mean, it really sounds like, oh yeah, I mean they have staking over in like Ethereum, and it's like yield for ETH. Wouldn't it be great if we have that? Well, you can't really have that, if you're on proof of work. You could have it if you go to proof of stake. It could change. It could like help in a bunch of other ways as well. But well, I think without Bitcoin moving to proof of stake, Bitcoin staking probably isn't going to be a big thing in any way.
Wow, I didn't know that you were so bearish on on staking, but I probably tend to agree with you that the demand side is dead. It's like everybody gets obsessed with this idea of, hey, I can earn yield on XYZ asset, but it's like who is paying for the yield?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I will gently push back on the one that you mentioned, where I do see a market for this kind of finality on the roll up in order to give economically secured pre-confirmations. Like we will need that. And so I'm curious, like if we didn't pay for that service, like would you just expect that sequencers offer trusted pre-confirmations? Like we're going to need some way to give instant, quick, snappy UX.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, so in Ethereum, centralized sequencers have been giving like instant pre-confirmations that are very fast, like snappy, quote unquote, for a very long time. Like that's one of the main like reasons why people like layer two. So that's a given. The question is then, well, like, do you trust the sequencer, or like does a sequencer make some kind of like economic, like some kind of commitment that like makes you have to trust it less? And you can do that. Like you can have like sequencer stake. We're seeing like a range of approaches basically in Ethereum land. Another one that's now picking up is like, and it's becoming viable technologically for the first time, is like putting a sequencer in a TEE, a trusted execution environment, which is like it's like a piece of hardware, where you can commit to running a certain piece of software inside, and you can't lie about it, right? And so the hardware itself commits to running the software and nothing else. And so that is another way of like securing a sequencer, because now whole software that posts the data to the layer one runs inside the TE, so it can't cheat. And it has another benefit, which is the sequencer is you're not only trusting the sequencer anyway to like post the precise ordering to the layer one, you're also trusting it like not to front run your transaction, for example, right? Or you're like reorder it, etc. Right? So if you're using a TE, then you can have like a lot of benefits like stack on top of each other, which is like if a transaction is encrypted to the TE, it can only be decrypted inside the TE and then ordered according to a pre-committed to ordering algorithm. And then also like with a commitment to post that exact like ordering to the layer one, right? So you want to have like a holistic way of thinking about your sequencer. So I agree, like having some kind of economic commitment to what you want to post on layer one is probably better than nothing. So although in practice people are like on Ethereum, they are like fine trusting the centralized sequencers because they tend to be operated by like a big entity that they trust, whether it's like the Optimism Foundation or Coinbase or Arbitrum or like Uniswap. But we are increasingly seeing like also people are interested in putting like sequencer in a TE because then you have like much less trust in the operator. You have like some additional trust assumptions. I mean, you have like overall like way fewer trust assumptions. You have like some net new trust assumptions about like where the hardware is not like compromised by the manufacturer, like pretty much. But it's like not a particularly risky like assumption for this use case because you're not storing like any kind of private keys inside or something. It's only for like in-flight transactions basically. And so I think more likely than that, like that's the kind of end game also that we're going to see on Bitcoin. Why? Because it's just like really good like user experience and like a really good mix of like security and UX and everything.
Yeah, I know this is a much, much deeper conversation, but this is my own personal questions here. Is this product that you're talking about, is like I know this is something that kind of like Flashbots works on. Is this what you would consider like rollup boost or flash blocks, or is it some combination of both, like a sequencer using this TE?
Yeah, okay. So Rollup Boost. So we talked about a little bit about like MEV and like how to democratize it at the base layer, right?
Right.
And so the way that we do this is through a concept like called PBS,
Mhm.
proposer builder separation. The proposer, in the context of Ethereum, I mean, there's like an entity called the proposer. They propose the next block, and then a bunch of other people like attest to that block. And the proposer can also decide what goes into the block. But they can also, like, they can do that themselves, but they can also delegate that to another party. And that party we call the builder. And so the builder is basically just like sourcing transactions, building the best block. I mean, they are just responsible for like for the block construction side of things. And so this is how we democratize MEV on layer one through PBS. And what Rollup Boost does is basically PBS for layer two. So it's like a way where you have a sequencer, but the sequencer becomes the proposer, and it can delegate the building of the block that it then like proposes to a builder, basically. And so Rollup Boost allows you to do that. And that itself gives you access to a bunch of upgrades and modules for improving your sequencer. And so one of those is flash blocks. So flash blocks is just the idea that, imagine you have a sequencer and the sequencer has like 1 second block time. So it's giving like 1 second already like pre-confirmations, right? The different levels of like confirmations given.
Mhm.
So the sequencer is giving these like 1 second pre-confirmations, but you can put a builder in front of it. And the builder is the party that's responsible for actually building the block, right? And then you're putting it in a TE. And then that builder is actually not building a block every second, but it's actually building 4 blocks every quarter second. And it's doing like a lot of nice things, like by not actually sealing the block, it's, putting like the computation of the state root at the end of the 4 blocks. So, it's really like engineering wise, like minimizing all the overhead. And so it's like parallelizing the building of the 4 blocks. And that allows you to get like the block building time down to only 250 milliseconds, which is, instant. It feels instant for the user. So like you do something, wow, you get confirmed. But it's still enough time to run actually an MEV auction like inside that 250 millisecond window. Like it's barely enough, but like we can do it. And you're getting the pre-confirmation from inside the TE, right? So your data is never actually like shown to anyone. Like nobody can access it, not even the sequencer. And before the block is sealed, right? So it's like a kind of very nice like package of things. Well, technically, flash blocks is like just the fact that like a builder is giving you 250 millisecond precoms. You can additionally put the builder in a TE, and you can also additionally have like other modules, some that like simulate the block and like filter out reverts, which if you have in our ecosystem is also quite nice, right? Because if you're trading, you put like you make a trade, but somebody else trades before you, and like the trade becomes invalid. Like you don't want that transaction to go on chain, and you pay extra transaction fees. It feels really bad. And so overall, like the idea of like filtering out reverts is key for users, is also key for the chain itself. In fact, because they're like chains that don't have that end up having like a ton of spam. Like whenever like and like gas is really cheap, and you don't have an MEV auction that's like explicitly kind of designed around this, you will get a lot of spam. Like all the layer 2 rollups have like 20, 30, 40% of their transactions are like spam from MEV, because it's basically people searching on chain. They have the same smart contract and they just like call it. They call it like 50 times per block, right? Like, and because it's very cheap, it's worth it for them because it only needs to work, 1 out of 1,000 times for them to like get this front run or get this back run, right? And then, everybody kind of pays the price, right? Like the state, like balloons, you have like all of these reverts in every block. And like the real like capacity available for users is like much decreased. And so I think that is like this idea of like, what do you do about the spam problem on chains that, in any kind of low fee environment is like a very kind of tricky one. So that's why a lot of knowledge and like skill is actually in like how do you make like a good like builder auction? Like what is the kind of whole what is like the way in which like transactions go like from users before they eventually land on chain? Like this whole like MEV supply chain is like this is driving a lot of what what the user perceives like as the user experience of that chain, right? Like how fast am I getting included? Is it private? Am I getting a revert? Am I being front run? Like all of those things, right? It's like kind of determined in this like one small like area of the protocol, right? And increasingly, it's like, is there going to be mining centralization? Is there spam? Like, it's affecting like a lot of things. Like in Flashbots, we like to say, well, it's like all MEV. Like MEV now, there's like no MEV industry anymore. Like MEV is just like, if you're like a protocol engineer, you're building a chain, like you have to think about MEV because MEV just touches everything. MEV in the sense of like, well, your whole like transaction supply chain, right? Because that's going to determine like a lot of the user experience and the decentralization of your chain.
Okay, so assuming that we're comfortable with like the trust assumptions of like the TE, is there any downside to using some sort of service like this, where you kind of have this separate sidecar and you have like rollup boost with the Flashbox? I'm just trying to understand like yeah, again, assuming that we're comfortable with the TE, could this be perceived as still being extractive to the users?
No. So ultimately it depends what you put in the TE, right? The TE is like a vehicle, right? Like who
Yes.
drives the vehicle is kind of, it's going to be decisive. And so so you can have different approaches, right? So first of all, the most obvious thing is like you run like a quote unquote like honest like block building algorithm inside, in the sense of, well, you don't peek at user transactions and like insert your own from outside, right? Like you don't want to do that, right? So fair, there's many definitions of fair, but like one definition you can use is like, there's a set of transactions going in at the same time, and like that set is going to have like the same treatment, and then there's one block that's coming out, right? That's like one possible definition. There are different ways to structure the auction that will lead to different outcomes. So you can have you can have a regular kind of you can, I mean, we call it like the greedy auction. Greedy auction is one that like maximizes value for the block producer, still within those constraints that I mentioned before, where there's no peaking, etc. Right? Like, but you will simulate transactions in many different ways and like find the combination that like maximizes the payment to the block producer, right? So that's what you want to do when you're like in a permissionless kind of environment. So for example, on Ethereum layer 1, block builders compete with each other for the proposer, for making the block, so they need to compete on profit. So that's what they will do. But then when you look at, for example, Unichain, what they are doing, they run a different type of auction. I call it like a priority fee auction. And this one would not actually be incentive compatible in a permissionless setting, because when you order transactions by priority fee, that's not actually the maximally valuable way of doing it. And so this has another benefit, and that's why they're doing it. So they know this, right? So they don't need to care about incentive compatibility because they are running the only sequencer in a TE. So they know, they trust themselves, right? And the users, trust that, like at least that, the TE is like not compromised. And so what they are getting out of it is they are basically, allows like for a form of like MEV recapture by applications. So when you order transactions by priority fee, then you can have an app that basically peaks at the priority fee and basically changes its own fee that it charges the user based on the priority fee that the user pays, which is like very interesting. And this couldn't work. Why? Because in a like permissionless setting, the user could set like 0 priority fee and just pay like the builder kind of like off band, basically. So it doesn't work. But when you enforce like payment via priority fee, you don't allow any like out of band payment, then this does work. And then you can have, for example, an AMM where the AMM knows basically, if I can see at the top of the block somebody wants to trade against my pool and they are willing to pay like 2 ETH to arbitrage that pool, I can now charge him 90% of that as a fee. And that money goes back to me and to my holders, right? To put the money, to my market makers who put the money in the liquidity pool. So it's like one way, like it's expanding the design space basically of like apps that you can build that are MEV resistant or like MEV kind of recapturing. And that makes for overall like a better DeFi ecosystem. And so, they are doing that. WorldCoin, which is like, some altments like kind of AI and like proof of personhood project. I mean, they use a block building algorithm that actually favors transactors that have like a proof of personhood, that have a world chain ID over those that don't. So it's like block building for humans, like it's like, you can basically like still differentiate. You can like try different stuff. Like you can be opinionated about still what you want to run. Like, I mean, but what a TE gives you is you can credibly commit to running this algorithm. Anybody can verify it using remote attestation. And you're also committing that you can't peek at any of the data that's going into the algorithm, like into the box, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. This is all very fascinating. I can see why you all have kind of found TEs as this like excellent solution to this like very pernicious and difficult problem. This might end up warranting another follow-up episode at some point. I know you've done plenty of other episodes on it, another podcast, but yeah, I think we're quite a bit over our time. But this has been a really awesome conversation, and so I want to thank you for your time, Hasu.
Same, David. Thanks for your time as well. Yeah, it's been really fun. It feels like coming home, It's like,
Yes.
like I haven't been here in a while. So it's, yeah, I really love talking about Bitcoin and there's so much potential.
First of many more. All right. Thank you again. We'll talk soon.
Talk soon.